All right. Well, thanks for being here, Josh.
Sure. Yeah.
Very excited to have you. I really think this is going to be a fascinating discussion. You've run this survey that we're going to talk about, but maybe before we do that, could you talk about the foundation behind the survey, the B.H. Roberts Foundation, what your mission is, what you're doing with it?
Yeah. So the B.H. Roberts Foundation, we started it about at the end of 2020, end of 2021. Maybe it was the end of 2020. Okay. Anyway, yeah. So it's been a few years.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a small foundation in Salt Lake City, and it's a nonprofit. And it's really focused on education and research related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we do a lot of projects. Mm-hmm. We've got about a dozen employees that work there. And we work on artificial intelligence research. We work on, we have a large database, about 10,000, 15,000 primary source records related to controversial issues in the church. A lot of that's church history work. So if you wanted to find out like, something Brigham Young said about the Adam God theory, we've got the original documents. And a lot of these are from, various archives, of course, the church archive, University of Utah, Brigham Young University, and then actually archives all over the country we source from. And if it's sort of just regular old church history, we probably don't have it. Yeah. But if it's something that's challenging and difficult, we've got that. So we've built this archival database, and then we have a website called Mormonr. You go to mormonr.org. Yep. And that's sort of a question and answer format around controversial issues in the church. We produce memes, Mormon memes.
Yes, great Mormon memes.
So those are on Instagram and on Twitter, X. And we do sociological research, which we'll talk about today. We're working on a Book of Mormon graphic novel. We have a wide variety of different projects.
Yeah. Fascinating. I'm curious on the controversial topics. Do you consider, what is the purpose of it, to be as objective as possible, or does it lean into sort of defense of the faith?
Well, we're pretty open. Like we are from a position of faith, but we have no problem sort of being really open about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we just lay it out there.
Yeah.
And we kind of, we try to make the questions like real down to earth, serious pointed questions about these issues. And a lot of our answers, of course, are, we don't know, or probably not, again, based on the primary source data. So everything is footnoted and goes back to the primary source database. So we don't rely on like, the opinion of this scholar or the opinion of this historian. We sort of say, well, maybe if the question is, what do historians think? We'll access and say, well, they think this.
Yeah.
But mostly it's, well, this is what the data says.
Yeah.
And then, people can decide what they want to accept or reject or how they want to feel about that. So
that's really
sort
interesting.
of what we do.
Yeah. I'm so curious if this was is this your general life orientation? Like why have you been so drawn to this idea that this paradigm that it's more beneficial to just lay everything out on the table?
Yeah, fair question. So my background's in software engineering. I studied large scale parallel data systems at UC Berkeley and spent my career in tech. So I have a bias towards data. And I want to know, well, what does the data say? And then how to evaluate that data and understand the data in context, and then and see all the data. Not all data is equal, right? If you have something that's a third-hand memory from 40 years later from someone who hates this other person, it's like, well, okay, let's understand that, but let's still see what they have to say.
Yeah.
Versus someone else who was present and says, well, this is what I saw or what I remember, and they wrote it the next day. And just getting that all out on the table. Because especially with history, history's a story. It's a narrative based on bits and pieces of data that we're trying to piece together. But step one is get the data.
Yeah.
And step two is, okay, let's understand the data. But if you don't have the data, all the data, you can't really begin to put together a full story.
That makes sense.
Totally.
I'm curious how this sort of boils down to your own faith, like especially as a software engineer, and just the way you think, like was your decision, I don't know what point this would have been, but like to be a person of faith, to be a religious person, was that a data driven decision, or how do you think about it?
I mean, maybe I suppose, right, depending on your definition of data.
Yeah. I think you're right. Like a personal revelation could be data.
Sure,
in some
that's
sense.
that's data. I guess that's a type of data.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the roots of my faith are based on personal experiences. But I mean, when I was at Berkeley, I had no intention of serving a mission. Occasionally I went to church, but for the most part, it wasn't part of my life. And some things happened, and I found myself studying Hugh Nibley and reading the Bible and reading the Book of Mormon and spending time at the Institute at Berkeley and radically reorienting my my goals in life. And a lot of that was really playing catch up. And then I served a mission in Boston, continued to play catch up, but it was sort of a data-driven catch up. I just felt like I needed an enormous amount of information, but foundationally, I had a testimony of the truthfulness that, hey, God is real, and he knows who I am, and he loves me, and there's something bigger in this life than first appears. And so that's sort of, I have kind of roots that are spiritual in that way, but I still have this hunger for data, and the data, some of the data is challenging to that faith. Most of the data is actually affirming to the faith. And you've probably, I mean, there's lots of sort of adages, but if you need to keep digging deeper, and I think Joseph Smith said, what did he say? Drink deep or taste not the clarion spring.
Yes. Rick Turley quoted this to us.
And that's the thing is like, look, if you I think he said shallow sips intoxicate the brain.
There you go. Yeah, that's right.
But drinking deeply sobers up again.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. If you just dabble a little bit with the data, that can mess your head up. But if you go all the way to the bottom and say, this is all the data there is, then you can start making some rational structures and building models that make sense. At least this is how my brain works.
Yeah. No,
and I'm not prescribing that for everyone. It's just that's worked for me. And I think there's some percentage of people of faith that need that, whereas other people are like, I don't actually care about that. I have a more maybe emotional connection or more they use intuition and life experiences, which are totally valid, but a very different way of understanding faith.
Yeah. I will just add, I have always heard that and thought, when you dabble in church history, for example, then it can become really problematic if you don't go deep enough. But I have also noticed that dabbling in a way that only supports the narrative, that you're like a shallow narrative, that can be equally problematic.
Sure.
Like I had always heard, like I'd heard it and metabolized that idea, don't look into the hard stuff unless you're going to go all the way in. But I think there's a way to only skim the surface, to like keep supporting this narrative that you have. And sometimes that's when you crash and burn, because you create this really rigid story that isn't true below the surface. And so I love this idea that usually the answer is to drink more.
Yeah.
So especially if you feel disturbed, like when there's a problem.
Are you familiar with Prince Rupert's drops?
No.
So around the, I think it was the 17th century in Netherlands, glass blowers would drop molten glass into water, and it would create these sort of tadpole-looking drops. There's a physical property of the glass that makes it incredibly hard. You can smash it with a hammer, and it will not break.
Really?
In fact, people have, you can find videos on YouTube, people have fired bullets at them, guns, and it shatters the bullet, and the glass is still there. But the tail, if you clip the tail, it explodes into pieces. I have
seen this. I didn't know that's what it's called.
It's called the Prince Rupert drop, because this guy named Prince Rupert brought them back to England and brought them to the science academies and says, guys, we got to study this. This is really strange. The reason I bring that up is because I think one of the problems with Latter-day Saints, or really anyone of faith, is they get so rigid. They say, I have to protect myself against anything that might cause doubt. The problem is at some point they hit a breaking point and they will shatter like glass. We need to be like trees and dig our roots deep into the most important things. God, Jesus Christ, family, concepts about love, meaning, making meaning in our life. Everything else, you just sway with the wind, right? And that way, when something comes up, you're not shattering, you're swaying, and you can go back and forth. Oh, that's interesting data. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not true. I'm okay with that because I'm rooted in things that actually really matter. So I think it's really important to
I really like that.
To not be so rigid. But it's scary because faith in general, I mean, the secularization of our country is, the data indicates it is a reality. And so people naturally are going to get defensive and have anxiety that friends and family are leaving faith, no matter what the faith is, whether it's Latter-day Saint or not. Psychologically, socially, there's a lot of benefits towards faith. And so when we see society moving away from faith, that can be a scary thing, and we want to get defensive.
It's interesting. It's one thing to be a spiritual person, potentially another to be a person of faith, another to be a religious person, another to be a Latter-day Saint. And I'm curious, just going back just briefly to your foundational experiences as a young person, did that point you more toward God or toward Jesus Christ, or was it to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints specifically?
Well, my context growing up in the faith, in my mind, I'm like, wow, I got to figure out if the Mormon faith is true, and if it is, then I don't have to worry about anything else. So it was the most efficient route, because alternatively, you could go explore all religions, and that's a fine thing to do. But the most efficient thing for me was, well, let's just figure out, this one claims to be true and exclusive. If it's not, it should be relatively easy to blow that up. So, I'll spend my time digging into this.
Interesting.
And it turned out to be quite robust. And fascinating. Frankly, it's one of the most fascinating religions, whether or not, you believe it or not. Right. It's a fascinating religion. And my lived experience really supported that as well.
Yeah. How do you feel now? I'm sorry. We should be talking about the survey.
Yeah, I know.
We're going to do it. This is on us.
I'm curious how you feel now, decades later, I guess, about exclusivity. And do you think about
it's
religion
30 years later?
Oh, okay. Not too many decades. Not too many decades. But for me, my perspective on what's true and what's not, and what that means about other things being true or not, has changed over my decades. Do you think about exclusivity the same way you did as, a person making the decision to go on a mission?
Well, I mean, the concept of exclusivity is, we could spend hours talking about that, but I mean, something that's relatively unique, I think, about the Latter-day Saint faith is this concept of exclusivity of priesthood authority. I think people get that confused with exclusivity of faith in Christ. And I think as people mature in the gospel, they start to realize, my gosh, there's not just other faithful Christians, but faithful Muslims that have not a faith in Christ, but a faith in God. And you start to see the human family in a more holistic sense. But the role that we as Latter-day Saints have in this restoration is unique. And there are some exclusive aspects of it. I think it's important to figure out how to balance that exclusivity of our mission with excluding people of other faith. And that's, I think, a very difficult challenge for a lot of people. We at the B.H. Roberts Foundation, we focus on Latter-day Saints and trying to connect with our community and trying to clear roadblocks and get introspection on our people, realizing, of course, the world is significantly larger than our tiny faith. So it's a balance, I think.
Yeah,
I like that. Yeah, I like that exclusivity of mission, because it also leaves open that other places can also have exclusive missions that are different and important. And I think that solves the problem of exclusivity for me, which is that it just gives you this like self-righteous outlook on the world. You really think that you have the one thing that everyone needs, and that really, to me, makes the world so much smaller and like restricts what I think you feel open to. But I like exclusivity of mission, because then you can go all in and be open to what somebody else might have to offer you about connecting to God.
I think the worst part of our nature combined with this exclusivity of mission creates not great stuff.
Yeah.
I think the best of our nature combined with exclusive mission can create beautiful and amazing things. And so I think it's really a function of it's spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
Final question before we get to the survey. Yeah. Why do you call it the B.H. Roberts Foundation?
Yeah. So the B.H. Roberts Foundation is named after B.H. Roberts. He was, I think, arguably the first intellectual in the church. He was the first general authority to really say, you know what, we have to balance the secular realities of the Book of Mormon and of faith with our spiritual understanding, and be okay asking hard questions and not knowing the answer to all the questions, and being open and honest about that. And so he was able to play devil's advocate a lot in his life. He butted heads with the brethren occasionally, but he was loyal. Ultimately, he would fall in line and say, "Hey, my faith is more important than anything else, and I'm able to set some of these challenges aside," because he really wanted the faith to be as strong as it could be. And so when outsiders would say, "Hey, these Native Americans, they're not speaking Hebrew. Why not?" B.H. Roberts, now we sort of laugh at that idea. But at the time, that was like, hey, that's a good question. What's going on here? And, he wanted to know the answers. Yeah. And so our foundation, in a similar way, wants to approach our faith in a faithful way, but not be scared of sort of objective scrutiny.
Yeah.
And also, it's really interesting. He was... I couldn't recite the quote, but he would say, look, we need to teach our young people truths and not faith promoting myths, because eventually they're going to grow up. And if they find out later that, hey, wait a second, I got a lot of sugar, but some of this medicine in here doesn't taste very good. It's going to hurt their faith.
Yeah.
And so let's try to take some medicine with the sugar and the health food with the fun stuff, and kind of combine that. And anyway, so that I found B.H. Roberts inspiring.
Yeah. And I know you're a fan of Jonathan Haidt. We've been reading The Coddling of the American Mind. And it just feels like we're ready for this shift where we stop avoiding the things that make us uncomfortable, stop putting it on a shelf, and really face up to why is this zinging a little bit, and why does this question make me so nervous? Maybe instead of pushing it away and expressing faith by not looking at it, maybe it's time to really embrace what we're curious about and what we're nervous about, and when we're doing that as a community together, it feels like it turns out to be a way to grow those roots down instead of protecting our fragility.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, society swings like a pendulum.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think over the last 20 or 30 years, sociological data indicates that we are in a very unique time in the last 100 years, or at least since we've been recording this kind of data. It's a very strange time. And I think the pendulum has swung quite far in one direction, related to divisiveness and misinformation and strange cognitive distortions. And I think trying to find not a compromised middle ground, but a more inclusive middle ground. where we say, you know what, we don't have to agree on everything, but we can talk about it.
Yep.
And we can be okay with each other, and we can understand each other. And that middle ground, I think, is what's vanishingly small.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is related to some of Jonathan Haidt's work, where we need to be, in some sense, braver. Not in the sense we see on social media, like, oh, that's so brave, but we need to be more courageous at like wrestling with difficult things, and then and being okay with other people having different ideas than ours.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I love that.
Let's let's talk about the survey. It's fascinating. So well, I'll let you set it up, but it sounds like this follows on the heels of a couple other surveys that were done in the last 15 years. And you went to great lengths to make sure that this is statistically and sociologically valid. Do you want to talk about that first, maybe?
Sure. Yeah. So Stephen Cranney is a sociologist and specializes in data analytics. He works at the foundation with me. We sort of partnered together and said, you know what, let's do the next big survey in Mormonism. The most recent ones, in 2011, Pew did a survey of about 1,000 Latter-day Saints in the U.S. and asked about different types of beliefs. That was motivated by Mitt Romney running for president. And so, of course, people are interested in the Latter-day Saint faith. A lot of it was politically oriented, but also general sort of beliefs, getting to know, your neighbor, the Mormon. Jana Reese and Benjamin Dahl did work in 2016, where I think it was about 1,600 Latter-day Saints. They did that through our internet-based representative panel. And a lot of their work, some portion was focused on former Latter-day Saints, which are a very difficult demographic to get data on. At BHR, we said, you know what, we really want to dig deep on this. So we ended up sending 80,000 postcards to every county in the country that had at least 15%, a 15% population of Latter-day Saints based on the religious census. And
so you send them to everybody, not just you. Well, you don't have data on who the Latter-day Saints are, right? We did a random sampling. Okay.
Right, because again, to make this statistically representative and rigorous, you have to waste a lot of money. is really what that means. So you do math and you end up randomly sending postcards to a lot of people. We also complemented it by advertising on the Meta network, that's Instagram and Facebook. To solicit people that had common interests, like BYU football, or were, they have their own algorithms to figure out how to. They won't allow you to target a religion, but you can sort of find adjacent interests to Latter-day Saints, and so half of our data set comes from that, and the other half comes from the postcards, and then you do a lot of math to basically make sure it's representative and not skewed. We expected some level of skew, and we did find it. The internet sampling skewed a little more progressive, for lack of a better term, but not a lot. And the postcard was a little less so. And then when you sort of amalgamate that data, we end up with about 3,800 survey respondents. About a third of them identified as former Latter-day Saints. So that's the largest, well, I think all around, that's the largest representative sample of Latter-day Saints in the US, as well as the largest sample of former Latter-day Saints. And so
did you set out in order, planning to find data on former Latter-day Saints as well?
Certainly that's an interest of ours.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think it's difficult to contextualize the beliefs and practices of Latter-day Saints without also understanding former Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
Because they are part of our culture as well. And I think there's a lack of information about former Latter-day Saints. Yeah. And so we were interested in that. I think an important thing to understand is that when you're doing this survey, ultimately, and this is a problem with all sociological surveys, you're only going to get data on people that respond.
Yeah.
So if there is some subset of Latter-day Saints that are like, we hate surveys, theoretically, they could have radically different opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Statistically speaking, that's very unlikely, and there's pretty robust history on the validity of taking a random sample, but that always exists. Now with the former Latter-day Saints, it actually becomes even more important though, because typically your Latter-day Saint is like, well, this is my faith, this is part of my life, I identify this way, I want to participate, I want to have my opinions heard. A former Latter-day Saint, you're going to have kind of two types. One is like, I actually have absolutely no interest in participating in a survey about my old faith. And we're not going to hear from them. We don't know how many there are of those people because again, they're silent. It's like dark matter in the universe. You just, they're out there, but you have to indirectly measure it. But former Latter-day Saints that say, you know what, I do want to share my opinion. We have that data. Now, is there a difference between the disinterested former Latter-day Saints and the interested? Probably. Mm-hmm. But again, we don't know. So when we talk about former Latter-day Saints, we're talking about a subset that had an interest to want to participate.
Okay. And how do you know, like, how are you checking for if the data is skewed? What are you comparing it to? Like to the old surveys or what, like, how do you know?
Well, we compare the postcard surveys, the sample, postcard sample with the internet sample. Okay. And we can consistently see a slight skew. Okay. Now, when we're amalgamating that data, essentially we're applying what are called weights. We can use like the Cooperative Election Survey or the GSS survey to get an idea of this is the typical age of a Latter-day Saint. This is the typical gender. This is demographic data, and then make sure our data conforms with that. Okay. There's lots of behind the scenes ways to get your data to make sure it's representative. Okay. And so, yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. Yep. So what was your goal? Like, what were you, is this just another way that B.H. Roberts Foundation is hoping to mine for something that is true so that you can get everything out on the table and then there's progress? Or like, what were you hoping to discover?
Yeah, I think this thematically aligns with the mission of B.H. Roberts Foundation, which is start with data. Yeah. If you're going to have a productive discussion about any topic, start with the data. And of course, when you're talking about Latter-day Saints as a people, what do they believe? What do they practice? What do former Latter-day Saints believe? What do they practice? Let's get the data first. And so because we have a strong interest, of course, in our community, we just thought this was the right thing to do, is to start with this data. And we anticipate we'll follow up with many other surveys, but we wanted to set a baseline on beliefs and practices.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I would imagine that part of the data processing you do is breaking this into cohorts of some kind, by gender or age or, race or what have you. Yeah. Is that part of it?
Well, so demographic, certainly there's a lot of ways to slice and dice data.
Yeah.
This is a snapshot of data in 2023. Mm-hmm. An exciting thing to do with data is to be able to get a cohort over time, which we can't because we have a single snapshot.
Yep.
But yes, the more data you have, that's why people really want, I want many thousands of respondents in my survey, because then you can really whittle down and say, well, what does this particular demographic believe? And you still have a statistically significant sample. Yeah. And so that's why it's important to get as many as you can. I mean, you could have 200 or 300 respondents in a survey, and it can be statistically valid if it's on if you're not slicing it up too much.
Yeah.
But if you want to say, I want to understand how, Polynesian female Latter-day Saints that believe in the historicity of the Book of Mormon feel about gay marriage. Okay, you better have a lot of data to be able to find that subset to get it to be statistically significant.
Yeah.
So what at the highest level, we took the Latter-day Saint sort of group and then former Latter-day Saints. And the next level, we broke down what we wanted to do is explore types of Latter-day Saints, because we're not all the same, mm-hmm. But there's there's an analysis, a statistical analysis you can do called a k-means cluster analysis. And
that's the first time that's been mentioned on this podcast. I'll just say that. I've not talked about k-means cluster analyses before.
And this, the clustering analysis, it's been done for many decades in sociology. It's basically you take a bunch of data and you say, show me the groups that are similar mathematically.
Yeah.
And there might be 2 groups, there might be 4 groups, there might be 5 groups. There were only 2 distinct groups.
This is fascinating. Yeah.
And we just call them cluster 1 and cluster 2.
Yeah.
The cluster 1 group was about 80% of Latter-day Saints fell into that. And they were pretty concentrated in their beliefs and their practices.
And this is currently identifying Latter-day Saints.
This is people that say, I'm a Latter-day Saint.
Yeah.
Right?
And by concentrated, you mean they share
beliefs and practices.
Okay.
So this 80%, they're paying full tithing. They believe God exists. They believe the Book of Mormon is literal. They support ideas that the church teaches, like we shouldn't ordain women to the priesthood, or we shouldn't seal same-sex marriages in the temple. That they align with the, for lack of a better term, orthodox teachings of the church, and they're active in the church. Then there's 20% in a distinct group that are less active. They still identify as Latter-day Saints. They still show up to church, not as much. And they have more heterodox beliefs in the church, where they're like, you know what, maybe we should ordain women, and maybe we should seal same-sex couples in the temple. Only a third of them believe in God. Oh. Only a third of them believe in the literal historicity of the Book of Mormon.
Can I ask about that belief in God?
Sure.
In the article that I read, it sounded like it wasn't necessarily an unbelief in God, but a sort of uncertainty. Is that fair to say?
Yes, exactly. Okay. And everything I'm saying, there's subtleties to. This is, I know God exists.
Okay.
Without a doubt, I know God exists. Yep. And so the sharp contrast is the second group, it's a third. So there's a lot of doubt.
Yeah.
But still, they're attending. They identify with faith. It's just very different than the first cluster. Now,
so when you say less, because we used to use less active, wasn't that like an official term for someone? So you don't mean less active in the, you wouldn't see these people in your ward. You're saying they show up, but they have more nuanced beliefs?
No, I mean, actually, literally, they don't show up. They
are coming less
they come
often.
less. They attend church less. They attend the temple less.
Okay. But usually there's some level of activity. They are a part of.
They are still part of our community. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. One is because they identify, and 2, they're coming at least several times a month.
Okay.
To some church-related functions.
Okay.
So they are present. They're just they're not
less active compared to that first cluster.
Exactly.
Okay.
Statistically enough that they're distinct in the cluster. So so on any given Sunday, for example, you can look out into the congregation, and maybe 1 in 7, 1 in 8 of the people you see will be in this cluster on any given Sunday. Yeah. So they're absolutely part of the community.
Yeah. This cluster 2 is really interesting. I know it's difficult with the snapshot rather than over time, but do you get a sense that cluster 2 is shrinking, or that it's growing? Do you get a sense that these people are on their way out and they used to be part of cluster 1?
These are great questions. We don't know the answers to them, right? Okay. If over time we could start to maybe get some insight into that. People leave the church, certainly from cluster 1, where maybe they're like Prince Rupert Strauss and they're really solid, and then they shatter suddenly. Yeah. And then there's people in cluster 2 that they've been that way for decades, and they're totally comfortable with where they've arrived in how they practice their faith and profess their faith. And they continue to be part of the community, and that's where they want to be.
Yeah.
We just don't know if if it's a transitionary way station or not.
Totally.
We just know that statistically they're very distinct. Again, practices and beliefs.
Yeah. How interesting. Okay, so give us more of an overview of what kind of other questions you were asking. You've mentioned a few of them. Are there any other things? Was it mostly about practices? Like, how often do you?
Well, again, practices and belief. So
how lengthy was the survey?
It was actually quite lengthy. It took about 20 minutes to do. It's around 60 questions.
Okay.
And the former Latter-day Saints had a different set. than the current Latter-day
So
Saints.
they identify themselves as former, and then they go into a branch.
That's right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the 80-20 split, they get all the same questions.
Yep, they get all the same questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so things like exclusivity, right? Does the current prophet have exclusive authority from God? Questions about.
Do you remember the answer between? I'm curious about the answer between those two.
Oh
groups.
yeah. I mean, I couldn't quote the exact number, but it's a lot less.
Really?
Yeah. The 20% group. They're like, yeah, we're not sure. We're kind of neutral, we're not quite sure about that exclusivity thing with the prophet. We're not quite sure that Joseph really saw God in the sacred grove. I mean, it's a lot of sort of tentative, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. That was so interesting. I want to hear the other questions, but that was the thing that struck me about their responses, that there were very few hard no's. No, I don't believe that. It was a lot of like neutral to yes, like somewhere between. Yeah. It was a lot of maybes, like so many maybes. And I'm super interested in the fact that this group is showing up and they're bringing a lot of their uncertainty with them. And
absolutely. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing is that, they're part of our community.
Yes.
They have callings. They're in leadership roles. They're part of our family. And how do we negotiate the fact that someone in your relief society or priesthood might, when you say bear your testimony with fervor, they might wince, or they might say, well, that's not how it works for me. And just being aware that they exist and they're there. And again, we don't know if they're static or if they're in some type of transition, either closer to the center or maybe a transition out. Yeah. But the fact that they are part of our community, I think, is really important. Yeah. And yeah.
Did you get a sense for how these two different clusters experience their religious participation emotionally? Like, is cluster one having a great time, and like because they're part of the 80% that it's easier, and the 20% is like, oh, this is really tough? Was there anything like that?
Yeah, we didn't. We couldn't tell you if cluster one or cluster two was happier or not. We can just tell you, what they believe.
Yep. And what they do to some extent,
and what they say they do.
Yeah. What they say they do. Yeah.
The cluster two, ideologically more progressive. Cluster one is more moderate and conservative, ideologically speaking.
Yeah.
What do you think this tells us about, from like a pastoral ministering perspective? How has this changed how you think about how you think about that when considering that 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 are in this cluster too? Because what comes to mind for me is like, wow, talking about dominoes, like building dominoes for somebody. If they're coming to the table with uncertainty, if you're already there, then the message that you might be receiving as someone in this cluster too is, if you don't know for sure about Joseph Smith, then you don't know about Book of Mormon, and you don't know about priesthood, and you don't know, and like the dominoes are being knocked over for you. It feels like it kind of goes both ways. So after seeing all of these numbers and all of these answers, is there something that has kind of settled for you about a way to be more pastoral in our wards? Like what could an address look like that could be nourishing for both groups?
Well, I think the first step is to be aware that we have a certain level of heterogeneity in our wards, and just that awareness alone, I think will go so far. And I think we've seen that. I've certainly seen that, where people are aware that not everyone's a Molly Mormon, Peter Priesthood clone copy of each other. And as soon as you break that idea, and that this is how you have to be a faithful Mormon, then everything about what you say and do and the tone and the content gets changed, I think, to be a bigger tent. Now, that doesn't mean you have to compromise and say, well, let's start undermining what this apostle said at General Conference. That's, I don't think, a requirement. But you can be aware that, people heard this differently. And so how I speak about it, depending on my flock and in my family, my local flock, my local family, being sensitive to the fact that people are in different places, I think can really make church more of a refuge for people, and less of something that might be prickly.
Yeah. And I think being sensitive to it, but also appreciating it to some extent, that not everyone is like you. It's probably not a mystery that if I took I would guess for our listeners that if I took the survey, I might be in cluster 2, And I think the trap that I have fallen into at times is like wishing that people in cluster 1 are like me, wishing that they were in cluster 2. And I think it goes both ways. I think some people in cluster 1 probably wish that cluster 2 people were like them. And I actually think that my insight over the past few years has been that we really need, as coming from a person that's probably in cluster 2, we need those cluster 1 people. We don't actually have an institution without people that are sort of creating, really creating a container. We have this specific set of beliefs and rituals and practices. If everybody were like me, we probably wouldn't have that, And Brian McLaren calls this a four-stage community. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, I think, to clusters, but I think we really should recognize, and I fail at this constantly, and I don't want to sound like I'm preaching, but what we need is a 2-cluster church. We don't need to say, as cluster 1 people, let's get cluster 2 to be like us, or as cluster 2 people, let's get cluster 1 to be like us.
Yeah, I think diversity is strength. In the church. But at the same time, if you don't have foundational beliefs and structure, then well, what are you?
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's that tension.
Yeah.
I think the worst parts of cluster 1 are destructive, and the worst parts of cluster 2 are destructive. Agreed. And I think being mindful of that is, where we are right now, this snapshot of where we are in the church, in our community. I think that just being aware that, hey, am I, whatever cluster you are in, am I being the best cluster 1 person I could be? Am I being the best cluster 2 person I could be? Because a cluster 2 person might say, I want to drag people out of cluster 1, and I want to, maybe deconstruct their faith to be more like mine. Mm-hmm. It's maybe that's not helpful for that person. And a cluster 1 person might say, that cluster 2 needs to believe just how I do. And here's the checklist. Maybe that's just not how their brain works.
Yeah.
and we have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And not set aside, defer the love and the hugging and the embracing in the community until they reach a certain point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh my gosh. I was just reading, I think it was in The Cosmic Egg by Richard Rohr last week. It was something by Richard Rohr. He said that the body of Christ is meant to be this symbiotic relationship, and that very often the person who believes that they're on the giving end and the person who believes that they're on the receiving end are very often reversed.
Oh, dancing, standing still.
Was it dancing, standing still?
Yeah.
Okay. But I love that idea that maybe that's the point, that we get in this rumble and we're going to think that we're doing it right. And the point is to gather and to be a little bit disturbed and to become more whole in that way by listening to something that disrupts the easy narrative that we may have without being in community. So super interesting.
We've also heard this other axis that you're referencing called virtue. So you could imagine an axis of belief, like cluster 1, cluster 2, and then there's a totally other one, which is sort of are you being, like you're pointing out, the very best version, or are you falling short? And I think it is an aspiration for all of us to get high on that virtue axis, just wherever your beliefs fall, are you in some way, following Christ, following the teachings of Jesus?
Yeah, absolutely.
Along that spectrum.
Can we talk about moral foundations theory? Because I feel like that kind of brings us right to do you have integrity about your values and wherever you're rooted?
So moral foundations theory was developed by Jonathan Haidt and a number of other social psychologists. It's a structure that helps explain how people reason about ideas, about policies, and about morality. And the idea is that, okay, you can do a poll and say which candidate do you like better, or which policy do you like better. But in the end, you just get, well, these people like this and these people like that. The next level deeper is, well, why? Why do they think this way? And so moral foundations theory, what's fascinating about it is it's a set of questions. You can give it to any population across cultures. I think 60 or 70 different cultural groups have taken the moral foundation theory, and it produces viable results. So it's the closest thing I think we have to a sort of universal human test. Not that it's perfect, but it goes very far in understanding how does this group of people think about foundational moral values. And the original moral foundations theory had 5 foundational values: harm or care, if something hurts something or not. Fairness, authority, and like authority is like, a question on how to test that is do you think children should be raised to respect authority?
Yeah.
And is loyalty separate? Okay.
Loyalty separate. So loyalty or in group, they have different terms for these. And that's like if your family member did something awful, do you still stand by them?
Yeah.
Are they still part of your family or not? And then finally, purity. And purity is, do you think chastity is an important value or not? Something as simple as that. Mm-hmm. And these 5 different values, you can take a relatively simple survey, and people quickly fall into categories. They follow patterns where when they're given a moral question, this is how they process it in their minds. I say, and they don't do this consciously, but they think, okay, is this fair? Does this hurt people? How does this affect the loyalty of a group? Is this, kicking against authority? Is this breaking down structure? Is this, and this happens on a subconscious level, and you can start to understand why people believe certain things.
Yeah.
For example, and what we found is former Latter-day Saints have a dramatically different moral foundations profile than current Latter-day Saints. And an example is like harm. Well, I think the church is harming people because they're making them feel bad about not being good enough, or they're shaming them for how they dress, or I think they are unfair to the LGBT community. And so harm and fairness in former Latter-day Saints is oversized compared to a moderately politically American. So that's sort of a baseline as you take the typical American who identifies as a moderate and say, well, how do they compare? And former Latter-day Saints are oversized in these 2 things. And in authority and loyalty and purity, they're actually undersized. They're like, this does not factor in.
Compared to
at
harm.
least nearly as much.
Exactly. Compared to
harm and fairness is oversized. So if you believe in a God that is okay with people suffering, that's going to be really hard for you. That's going to be a very difficult thing. If you believe in a God, in a traditional Latter-day Saint God, is okay with things being unfair, at least temporarily in mortality, you're going to have a really hard time with that.
Or by extension, I would say if this feels like value number 1, if you feel like what you're seeing is your faith community harming, then it makes sense that there's some nuance there. Like maybe this isn't about God. This is about my church is doing harm.
Oh, sure.
And this matter, like if that matters so much, you can see how that would be so much more distasteful than someone who where loyalty feels like number 1, where you're going to defend what might even be a little bit uncomfortable because you really feel this sense of loyalty as a virtue,
So there's distinctions, right, between the church and between God. What's interesting in the former Latter-day Saint community, based on the survey data that we have, is I think there's a little bit of baby and bathwater going on there. Most of them, nearly half, simply don't believe in God at all anymore. And they don't believe there's any way to find out if there's a God. So that's nearly half of former Latter-day Saints. On, I think, a positive note, I think it's about a third of them, nearly 30%, still believe in God. But the vast majority have said, you know what? And perhaps that's because of a fairness harm way of seeing, or it could be other things. We don't know. We just know there's a correlation between the 2. Incidentally, former Latter-day Saints, 3/4 of them really don't like the church as an institution. They're like, we very much do not like this. They're sort of neutral to positive on the people. Latter-day Saint people.
Okay.
Not terribly warm, but sort of neutral.
At least you took the survey. That's interesting because I can see how, like, if you have feelings, you would be more likely to take you want to, like, I would love to share my opinion about this thing that I feel fired up about still.
There might be, Latter-day Saints that were baptized when they were 10 years old and never went to church after that. And, they don't identify as Latter-day Saints, but they're certainly not going to take a survey related to that. So we just don't have insight into that population.
Yeah.
And this is the first time that moral foundations theory has been applied to Latter-day Saints. Is that
That's
right?
right. Yeah. This is not, but it's been applied to other religious populations.
Yeah.
But not to the Latter-day Saints. And so that's what's really interesting. In fact, we actually saw a difference between cluster 1 and cluster 2 with moral foundations as well.
Along those same lines?
The cluster 2 tended to align more ideologically liberal. So there's a pattern with moral foundations of people that self-identify as strong liberals, political liberals, strong conservatives, moderates, and cluster 2 is closer to the liberal. But they don't abandon things all the way, like loyalty and authority and purity.
So to be clear, so liberal, generally someone who identifies as liberal also usually tests high on unfairness and harm, right? Those are the values that test higher.
That's right.
Okay, and then someone who identifies as more conservative will usually test higher in purity, authority.
It's not that they test higher, I don't think.
What's interesting is that no one tests terribly high on purity.
Oh,
really?
Interesting.
Except Latter-day Saints.
Oh,
yeah. So,
fascinating.
I mean,
okay, so not test high. What do you mean?
What I'm saying is, I think the data that Jonathan Haidt published in The Righteous Mind is that conservatives showed a fairly even breakdown across all five values, and liberals showed that they were very high on harm and fairness,
individualizing values, and then the binding values. Those are the two categories. Right. So yes. People that are politically liberal, the individualizing values of fairness and harm, they're oversized on.
Okay.
And they're dramatically lower in the binding ones, whereas the conservatives and moderates are pretty even.
Across
binding
the board.
meaning they bind you to your community. Like they're more like community based.
They're as far as moral foundations go, they're more balanced.
Okay.
Again, not to put a value on being balanced or not.
No,
but they are more balanced.
Yeah.
Now, but what's interesting when you're comparing political moderates and conservatives to Latter-day Saints, purity just isn't that important in 2023, or or at least in the 21st century. Not terribly important even to conservatives. The Latter-day Saints, sacredness and purity. And it's not just, sexual chastity, but
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah. It's actually, it encompasses just the concept of the sacred.
Okay.
The Latter-day Saints are way oversized in that. And it's not surprising, of course. Our religion, our theology is about the divine and the sacred. And so, but that's very noticeably different.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that is so interesting. So could you look at this and say, okay, we are nourishing to somebody who is high on all of these things like loyalty and purity and authority. But for people who feel like they settle on this unfairness and harm, it seems like they're having a lot of trouble in this community, in the same community that is working for people who value loyalty and purity.
Yeah,
and authority.
I think that was one of the biggest takeaways. I mean, as someone who works in data and controversial topics and apologetics, data-driven people are like, well, all you got to do is just show them the data, right? In fact, I don't think that's true at all. I think for some very small subset, I think it's very helpful. Mm-hmm. But this data, this moral foundations data, tells a different story. And the story that it's telling is that how you think about morality on the harm and fairness scale overrides everything. It doesn't matter what data you show someone. They're going to say, well, look, that's neat data you shared with me. However, the harm is here and the unfairness is there. So no, thank you. And that's a much more difficult problem, is to help someone see value in loyalty and authority and in sacredness. That's a difficult thing to, because I think everyone would argue, hey, the rule of law is important, right? I mean, I think generally people say we like the rule of law. We don't like corruption in politics or in a community. We want people to follow the rules. And so some moderate level of that is going to be agreed upon by everyone. But if someone has decided, you know what? No, I don't believe in, I am something about the concept of authority and rules. I've gotten to the point where I reject all of it. You have a lot of conceptual work to do with that person to get them to a point where they're more socially moderate in their values.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me that somebody could feel like they're recognizing this gap, like they're recognizing that there is harm and there is unfairness. And so it feels more important because it's what's not there. Like it's easy to feel like I value loyalty and we all value loyalty. And so nobody needs to speak for loyalty because it's the norm, you know? And so I could see how maybe it feels like these are more important because it seems like it's missing. It seems like it's it's a place where we're weak as a community, or at least I feel like this really maps to the experience that, I mean, I guess I relate to it personally, but also to the experience of good friends and family members who've stepped away, that it feels like their integrity demands that they step away. Like it doesn't seem to me so much that they're choosing to stop valuing authority and loyalty. It just seems like these other values feel so heavy and so important that they can't, with a clear conscience, stay, you know? And so I really love moral foundations theory because of the way it helps you name the values that people are operating from. And I think it brings a lot of clarity to the situation. But I wonder if in some ways this data is a call, like is a clarion call to say, man, like we have something here that we need to talk about, because all of these people who care about this can't sit with it anymore. Like they're like, they feel like they have to step away or their integrity is too crushing, you know?
Well, yeah, that brings up a lot of interesting points. People asked us, hey, did you find out why former Latter-day Saints left the church? And we had a cursory set of questions on that. It's less interesting to us because other surveys have done that. And part of the problem is it's very similar to asking a divorced couple, why didn't you get divorced? And there's been a fair amount of research on this topic. Divorced couples, they see the world differently than each other, not surprisingly. And they will place blame on each other. And they'll cite things that are mutually exclusive. And it's really hard to get to the root of the issue. So asking a former Latter-day Saint, why did you divorce yourself from the church? They're going to give you data. But like a divorced couple, in a very difficult emotional divorce, you perceive the world differently than your former spouse. And oftentimes that's why you got divorced, because you see the world differently. So it's very difficult to get data on this. And moral foundations is a great way to step back and say, okay, fine. Yeah. We're not going to assign blame. Are we thinking differently? Yeah. How are we seeing the world differently?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's why this comes back to good information. Like having data to start with is a way to open up the conversation and say, okay, unfairness is a real issue for some significant portion of value driven people. And so how can we talk about this in a way that helps feel satisfying to people who care so much about these values that for some reason feel undernourished in this community, you know?
And Tim, like you said, in some sense, you can evaluate this as a balance issue, right? All of us appreciate these values. Yeah. It's a question of, loyalty is a deal breaker for me. If hypothetically, right? If you say one thing that's critical about the church, I'm writing you off. Yeah. Like, I think most people would say, yeah, that's probably not healthy. Yeah. That's probably not healthy. Someone else, again, might on the harm. Wow. You really said something hurtful over the pulpit. I'm out of here. This is not a safe place for you. Yes. So it's, I wish we could apply temperance. Yeah. A little bit of temperance and moderation.
And forgiveness.
Forgiveness. and recognize that people have different values.
Right.
And at least I hope that people can become more balanced.
Yeah. Well, and I want to clear up a methodological thing that I think sort of has bearing on this hypothesis that maybe former Latter-day Saints and to some extent Cluster 2 are over-indexing on care and on harm and fairness because that's what they see as the problem right now. But I don't think in the survey it's some limited number of beans overall that you can drop into particular buckets, is it? Like you can choose to be high based on your answers on all 5
moral
foundations, right?
Absolutely.
So,
it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Like people that take this, some people are high on every single one. They're like,
yep.
Wow, all these, everything in my life, I evaluate morally all the time across the spectrum. And there are people like that. Other people are like, morality in general is not something that's part of my life. It's not something I think about. I don't think about these values.
And you can
I
score
don't
low
care that
everywhere.
much. And it might be low everywhere.
Okay.
So
it's not like you have to pick. Okay.
No, it's not like a binary thing. It's just a natural index that falls. And again, that's what's fascinating about this is that we see this clustering that's very distinct. And so you can, if someone showed me a moral foundations profile, I could reasonably predict what political party they're in. I could reasonably predict if they're a former Latter-day Saint or not. I might be able to pick if they're in cluster 1 or cluster 2. And that's what's fascinating about this is, again, they're just saying, hey, this is how I see the world. And we get a little bit of insight into how it, and again, it's not good or bad. It's just, it's the lens they see the world through.
The question that's arising for me naturally, I guess, right now is probably not answered by the data in particular, but like this does seem to speak to a polarization that we're obviously experiencing in American society. I think it's probably true. And, we live in this world to some extent, but among Latter-day Saints and former Latter-day Saints as well, there's certainly, in many cases, there's hurt. There's divide. And conversations across these divides can be very difficult to have, it seems like, in today's day and age. Have you thought about how we can start to talk to each other more? I mean, and obviously that's a leading question to some extent, but have you thought, how we can attempt to heal some of these divides?
That's a, really important question. And the data is relatively limited on answers to that. Like I said earlier, I think step 1 is recognizing the moral lens that we're seeing through, and recognize the goodness of the morality that you see and the value. Maybe you're over-indexed it, in my opinion, but it's good. Harm and fairness are good. Rule of law, authority, and loyalty, there are really good aspects to that. We can focus on the shared morality and not so much a specific issue. And again, I would encourage people to be more balanced in the way they see the world, because I think one of Haidt's sort of thesis is that successful societies tend to have more balance in how, and I think the balance is good because those values are really good. There's great things about those values. I think when you get radically imbalanced, and I think you see on the extreme end of conservatism, you see some imbalance. Moderate and conservatives and moderate liberals, it's not as extreme. But the extreme ends is where I think that division comes in, and it can really, it can be destructive.
Yeah, I think you're making a really important point here. It can be so easy when you're looking at someone across the political or religious divide or whatever it is, to see your differences as the result of moral failings, when often they're the result of moral values that are deeply, deeply held. And if you can make that paradigm shift, man, it helps you see someone in a different light.
I think hey, and it's, I can't remember who said it, but they say something like, it's better to talk about values and concepts over people and things. And I think talking about concepts about like, okay, harm and fairness, I agree with you. Those are really important. Let me tell you how I think about harm and fairness. Let's talk about authority or rule of law. Like, let's talk about that. It's a great way to talk about concepts and values where you can really find common ground with people. Mm-hmm. And it's a little esoteric. Maybe it's not the most fun thing to talk about during Thanksgiving, but some people like me find it really fascinating. Other people want to talk about the football game or the election. But whenever you hear these conversations, I think it's really valuable to say, well, what values are being elevated here?
Yeah.
And what values are being demoted?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's so useful. And it seems like this really is the point of community, that our different perspectives should be complementary, that we should be sort of balancing and tempering each other. And that's going to cause a lot of friction, but that's how we grow. Like that, it really is how we become stronger versions of ourselves as a community, but it's really uncomfortable. And it's interesting how easy it is to label someone as valueless when they disagree with you.
Oh, sure.
I love this idea that like there's you can trust that it's rooted in something that you respect. And like if you decide to engage on that Thanksgiving conversation, eventually you'll be able to get to something where you can respect that the value here is loyalty. And maybe I don't feel as fired up about loyalty on this topic, but like you can respect that that's there, and that
well,
at
if
some
they are
point,
having that conversation at Thanksgiving, there's at least some minimal loyalty in the family.
There you go.
Yeah, to show up. So there's some. If they're not there, then maybe that says something about their value of loyalty.
Yeah.
But it's what's also interesting. I think this concept of marriage is so important with faith, and with moral foundations. Men and women are actually different in their moral foundations.
Really?
There's a statistical difference between the two.
How so?
I bet you can guess.
I think women are probably higher on harm. That's what I would guess.
Harm and fairness.
And fairness too.
Yeah.
Harm and fairness.
So same divide as in conservative, progressive?
Not nearly
Not
as
to the same extent.
Yeah, not to the same extent. But there is a statistical distinction between men and women in those areas. But again, they're relatively subtle. But there is a difference because, shocker, men and women think differently. And what's fascinating about this is, of course, it's across cultures.
Yeah.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
And that can help also, again, in a practical sense in a marriage.
Yeah.
You're having a dispute about how do we raise the kids, or how do we, know, and not to say, hey, all women are this cookie cutter profile and all men are this one, but understanding like there are values at play here. We all value these, these virtues, but let's talk about how we're indexing them in a particular application.
That's fascinating.
I keep thinking about this interview we did with Pete Davis, and he talked about being a prophetic voice. And he's coming from outside of our tradition, he's not talking about the prophet. He just means that the idea was that when you come to community, you're bringing all of your baggage, good and bad, like your gifts, your perspectives, your values. And so being a prophetic voice can sometimes mean speaking up when you feel like you're the only one in the room, or that you're seeing an imbalance that doesn't feel obvious to the room. And I just love the idea that's a good part of community, that like those are good conversations to have, wrestling it out, and everybody disagrees. That's not broken community. That's healthy community.
Yeah.
When people speak
being
up.
in the tech industry for 20 years, executive teams and board of directors.
Oh, wow.
If you have people around the table that all agree, something has gone wrong.
Wow.
Generally speaking. Now, consensus is different. When we say, okay, well, we've talked about this issue, we've wrestled with this issue, but we have to arrive at a decision. So let's make a consensus about what the best thing to do is, given the limited information we have. That's a healthy thing to do. But if that process of consensus happens like that, because everyone's like, yes, we all agree.
Wow.
Something's gone wrong.
Yeah.
And that is a sign of an unhealthy company. And it's a sign that perhaps things are going south.
Yeah.
Wow. That's
fascinating.
so interesting.
And what's also interesting in studying 20th century church history, we have access to a lot of minutes from the First Presidency or from the Brethren. They don't agree.
Arguing.
I wouldn't call it arguing. I mean, these are really good men that I think have achieved some level of self-actualization. So I would never call it arguing, but you can certainly see there's passion.
Yeah.
There's passion and not full alignment on things. Yeah. But again, they reach consensus and then they move forward. You have to reach consensus to make progress. And so it's a funny thing, right? We're supposed to be one with Christ. How can we be one with Christ, but also have a unique identity and a unique a diversity in that unity? And that's the tension, I think, is the challenge of all faith communities, is how to be one, but also have tolerance for some level of diversity. And then you get into, boundary maintenance and all sorts of complicated topics. But
fascinating.
Yeah, which would be part of the conversation. Yeah. Okay. So interesting. I thank you so much. It's great to just have this to reflect on and recognize how this is happening in your word. And without the data, you probably just recognize little comments that make you wonder about where someone's coming from. And it's really interesting to just have some actual data and see the likelihood of a Sunday school class makeup, and what's really happening in the room.
We have an intuition, right? And, and our intuition is based on our own experiences. And we can't have all the experiences and be all places and know all things. And so we are limited in our sort of bubble. And some of our intuitions are better than others because we're able to have more diverse experiences, especially online. People have megaphones and it's really hard to know what's normal. Statistically speaking, what's normal and what's not normal because of these platforms and these megaphones. So again, you start with the data and you say, okay. And of course, I think more people would do this, but it's a lot of work, it turns out, to get statistically valid, representative data. And so we'll continue doing that. That's what we do at the foundation, is try to find the data, try to make sense of it, try to put it in a context that can support faith. Because generally speaking, I my bias is faith of any kind really is a very powerful, very human value that does really good things for our human family.
Well, thanks for sharing your faith and for the painstaking work that you and your colleagues are doing for work like this. Thanks for what you're doing with BH Roberts generally, and for having this conversation with us.
Yeah, it was really a lot of fun. It's great to spend time with you guys.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks. You. All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Josh Coates. If Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.